Every Saturday afternoon, like clockwork, she appeared at the Fort Jackson training grounds. The soldiers called her the Shell Lady, a quiet woman in her early 40s who volunteered to clean the shooting range and collect spent brass after the recruit training sessions. Elizabeth Raines looked exactly like what you'd expect from a civilian volunteer. Simple khaki pants, a plain button-down shirt, shoulder-length brown hair usually pulled back in a practical ponytail, and thick-rimmed glasses that made her look more like a librarian than someone who belonged on a military installation. She was small, maybe 5 feet 4 inches, and moved with the kind of careful, measured steps that suggested she was trying not to draw attention to herself. The young soldiers barely noticed her most days. When they did, it wasn't with respect. "Hey, Shell Lady, you missed him some over here," Private Martinez would call out, deliberately kicking empty ammunition boxes in her direction. His buddies would laugh, especially when she'd simply nod and walk over to collect whatever they'd scattered. "Think she's ever even held a gun?" Private Johnson whispered loudly enough for her to hear. "Probably jumps every time we fire." Elizabeth never responded to their taunts. She'd arrive precisely at 3 in the afternoon, after the main training sessions ended, and methodically work her way across the range. She'd sweep up brass casings, police the area for trash, and occasionally stand at the edge of the firing line, watching the late afternoon practice sessions with those thick glasses reflecting the desert sun. The training instructors tolerated her presence because she was useful. Someone had to clean up after the recruits, and having a civilian volunteer meant less work for their soldiers. Staff Sergeant Miller, the range supervisor, had processed her volunteer application months ago without much thought. The paperwork looked standard: local civilian, clean background check, willing to work for free. What was there to question? But if anyone had been paying closer attention, they might have noticed things that didn't quite add up. Like the way Elizabeth's cleaning pattern wasn't random. She moved systematically, covering every inch of the range in a specific sequence. That would give her visual access to all entrances and exits. Or how she always positioned herself where she could observe the most advanced training exercises. Never the basic rifle instruction that happened in the morning. They might have noticed that her simple civilian clothes were actually made from ripstop fabric, the same material used in military combat uniforms. That her glasses weren't just thick prescription lenses, but had an almost imperceptible tint. That suggested ballistic rating. That she moved with the kind of fluid, economical motion that came from years of physical training, not the awkward shuffle of a middle-aged civilian. Most telling of all, they might have realized that Elizabeth Raines always seemed to know exactly when to be somewhere else whenever the range went hot with live fire exercises. She'd find a reason to move to a different section, always ending up in a position that provided perfect overwatch of the entire training ground. But the soldiers saw what they expected to see: a harmless volunteer who cleaned up their mess and stayed out of their way. They had no idea they were being watched, evaluated, and cataloged by someone with skills that would terrify them if they knew the truth. The first hint that something was different came on a particularly busy Saturday. The advanced marksmanship class for Special Forces candidates was running late, and tempers were running short. The candidates were struggling with a long-distance precision exercise, and their instructor, Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, was growing frustrated with their performance. "Your breathing is all wrong, Williams." "Your stance is sloppy, Patterson." And Thompson, "You're jerking the trigger like you're trying to start a lawnmower." Elizabeth was collecting spent brass near the 700-meter line when she heard the comments. She glanced over at the struggling soldiers, and for just a moment, her composed expression flickered. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and she took a half step toward the firing line before catching herself. She knew exactly what they were doing wrong. Could have corrected every mistake in 30 seconds. but she forced herself to turn away and continue collecting brass casings, her movements perhaps a little more rigid than usual. That's when Private Martinez decided to have some fun. "Hey, shell lady," he called out, loud enough for the special forces candidates to hear. "You know anything about shooting? Maybe you could give these hotshots some pointers." The laughter that followed was cruel and dismissive. Elizabeth's cheeks reddened, but she didn't respond. She just kept working, her head down, while the soldiers enjoyed their joke at her expense. But Sergeant Rodriguez had been watching, and something about Elizabeth's reaction bothered him. The way she'd moved toward the firing line, just for a second, before stopping herself. The way she held her shoulders when she walked. The way her eyes constantly scanned the range, even when she was focused on cleaning. "Knock it off, Martinez," Rodriguez ordered. "Show some respect." As the afternoon wore on, Elizabeth finished her work and prepared to leave. She gathered her simple cleaning supplies, nodded politely to the soldiers who bothered to acknowledge her, and walked toward the parking area with that same measured, careful pace. But as she reached her car, a plain sedan that looked like something a schoolteacher might drive, she paused and looked back at the training ground. Her expression was unreadable behind those thick glasses, but there was something in her posture that suggested she was making a decision. The next Saturday, she arrived with a small toolkit. When asked about it, she simply said she'd noticed some of the equipment needed minor adjustments and thought she might be able to help. No one thought much of it. After all, she was just a shell lady. They had no idea that Elizabeth Raines was about to change everything. The second Saturday in November brought an unexpected crisis to the Fort Jackson training grounds. The advanced marksmanship assessment for Special Forces candidates was supposed to be routine, a final test before the soldiers moved on to the next phase of their training. But 15 minutes into the exercise, disaster struck. The primary long-range rifle jammed completely. Not just a simple misfire or feeding issue. The bolt was locked solid, and the trigger mechanism seemed to be completely seized. Private First Class Davidson, the designated marksman for his team, had been in the middle of his assessment when the weapon simply stopped responding. "What the hell?" Davidson muttered, performing the standard immediate action procedures. Tap, rack. Bang, nothing. He tried again, his frustration growing as precious seconds ticked away. This test was pass-fail, and a malfunction like this could end his Special Forces aspirations before they really began. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez hurried over, his expression grim. The backup rifle was in the armory, a 20-minute round. Trip that would force them to restart the entire assessment. With only one testing window scheduled for the day, this could derail the timeline for 6 different candidates. "Let me see it," Rodriguez said, taking the rifle from Davidson's hands. He worked the action, checked the chamber, examined the bolt. After 5 minutes of troubleshooting, he was forced to admit defeat. Something seriously wrong with the trigger group. I'd never seen anything like this. The other candidates gathered around, their own anxiety building. They'd all been preparing for this assessment for months. A delay now could mean weeks of additional waiting, and in the Special Forces pipeline, time was everything. That's when Elizabeth Raines stepped forward from where she'd been quietly collecting brass casings, near the 300-meter line. "Excuse me," she said in that soft, almost apologetic voice that had become familiar to the soldiers. "I couldn't help but notice the problem. The trigger mechanism is misaligned." The silence that followed was deafening. 6 Special Forces candidates, and their instructor all turned to stare at the quiet woman in civilian clothes who apparently thought she could diagnose a weapons malfunction that had stumped them all. Rodriguez's first instinct was professional courtesy mixed with irritation. "Ma'am, I appreciate you trying to help, but this is a complex mechanical issue. These rifles are precision instruments that require The sear engagement is off by approximately 2 millimeters. Elizabeth continued, her voice still quiet but carrying a strange authority. There's probably a burr on the trigger bow that's preventing proper reset. If you remove the trigger group and examine the contact surfaces, you'll find scoring that indicates metal-on-metal interference. The technical specificity of her diagnosis was startling. Rodriguez found himself actually considering her words, even as part of his mind rebelled against taking mechanical advice from a civilian volunteer. What would you know about that? The voice came from behind him, sharp with dismissal and more than a hint of condescension. Lieutenant Morrison stepped forward, his uniform crisp despite the afternoon heat. James Morrison had been assigned to the training facility for 8 months, and he'd made it clear from day one that he had little patience for irregularities or interruptions to proper military procedure. He was tall, well-built, and carried himself with the kind of confidence that came from knowing his rank gave him authority over everyone present. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step back," Morrison continued, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. "This is a military assessment with classified equipment. Civilians aren't authorized to handle or examine these weapons." Elizabeth took a step back, her hands clasped behind her back in a posture that somehow managed to be both deferential and subtly defiant. "I was only trying to help," she said quietly. "Well, your help isn't needed," Morrison replied. "What you need to do is stick to collecting brass and leave the actual military work to the professionals." The candidates exchanged glances. Morrison's tone was harsh even by military standards, and there was something unnecessarily cruel about the way he was dismissing the woman who'd volunteered her time to help keep their range clean. But Elizabeth didn't argue. She simply nodded and turned away, walking back toward the area where she'd been working. Her movements were controlled, precise, but there was something in her posture that suggested she was exercising considerable self-restraint. Rodriguez watched her go, then turned his attention back to the jammed rifle. 20 minutes of additional troubleshooting confirmed what Elizabeth had suspected. There was indeed a burr in the trigger mechanism, exactly where she'd indicated. The repair was simple once they knew what to look for, but the delay meant the assessment had to be postponed until the following week. As the candidates packed up their equipment, more than one of them found themselves thinking about the quiet woman who'd apparently diagnosed their problem in seconds while they'd all been stumbling around in the dark. "How do you think she knew?" "That?" Private Davidson asked quietly. "Lucky guess," Morrison replied, but his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Old Master Sergeant Wilson, who'd been observing the assessment from the tower, climbed down slowly. At 58, he'd seen more military training than most people could imagine, and he had an eye for details that others missed. He'd been watching Elizabeth Raines for weeks now, and something about her had been nagging at him. "Rodriguez," he called out as the instructor finished packing up the problematic rifle. "Walk with me for a minute." They moved away from the candidates, and Wilson lowered his voice. "That woman, the way she handled that diagnosis, the terminology she used, that's not something you pick up from watching television." "What are you thinking, Master Sergeant?" "I'm thinking that someone who can identify a sear engagement problem from 20 feet away has handled a lot of weapons in her life. Professional level familiarity. The kind you get from extensive training or extensive use." Rodriguez considered this. Maybe she's a veteran. Plenty of former military work, civilian jobs on base. Maybe, Wilson agreed. But there's something else. The way she moves. The way she positions herself. The way she was standing when Morrison shut her down. Did you notice her stance? Rodriguez had to admit he hadn't been paying attention to her posture. "Textbook ready position," Wilson continued. "Weight balanced, hands positioned for rapid movement, eyes scanning for threats. That's not civilian body language. That's someone who's been trained to fight. As they talked, Elizabeth finished her work and headed toward the parking area. She moved with that same careful, measured pace she always used, but now both instructors found themselves watching her differently. "Should we run her background again?" Rodriguez asked. "Might not be a bad idea," Wilson replied. "But let's be discreet about it. If she is former military, she might have her reasons for keeping quiet about it." As Elizabeth's sedan disappeared down the base access road, neither man could shake the feeling that they just missed something important. The quiet woman who collected their brass casings had demonstrated knowledge that suggested a level of weapons, expertise that didn't match her civilian volunteer status. But it would be another week before they realized just how dramatic that mismatch really was. And Lieutenant Morrison, walking back to his office with a frown on his face, found himself thinking about Elizabeth's diagnosis of the rifle problem. Her technical accuracy had been impressive, but there was something else that bothered him. Something in her eyes when she'd stepped back from the weapon. She hadn't looked defeated or embarrassed by his dismissal. She'd looked patient, like someone who was used to waiting for the right moment to act. For reasons he couldn't quite articulate, that patient look made him very uncomfortable. The following Saturday brought crisp November air and an unexpected opportunity that would change everything. Elizabeth arrived at her usual time, but instead of immediately beginning her cleaning routine, she found herself approached by Captain Reynolds, the range officer. "Ms. Raines," Reynolds said, his tone professional but not unkind, "I have an unusual request. We have a scope alignment issue with one of our precision rifles, and I was wondering if you might be able to help us test it." Elizabeth looked up from the cleaning supply she'd been organizing, genuine surprise flickering across her features. "I'm sorry, Captain. I'm not sure I understand." "Well, after last week's incident with the jammed rifle, Sergeant Rodriguez mentioned that you seem to have some technical knowledge about weapon systems. We have a rifle that's been giving us trouble. The scope seems to be off, but we can't pinpoint the problem. We need someone to fire a few test shots to help diagnose the issue." It was a reasonable request, but Elizabeth hesitated. Around them, the usual Saturday afternoon crowd was gathering: Special Forces candidates, training instructors, and the regular weekend warriors who used the range for practice. She could feel eyes on her, some curious, others skeptical. "I don't know if that's appropriate," she said carefully. "I'm just a volunteer. Surely one of your soldiers would be better qualified to." "Actually, that's the problem," Reynolds interrupted. "We need someone who's not familiar with this particular rifle. Our regular shooters have been compensating for the alignment issue without realizing it. We need fresh eyes and a clean test." Lieutenant Morrison had been listening from nearby, and he stepped forward with barely concealed irritation. "Captain, with all due respect, is this really necessary? We're talking about precision equipment here. This is a civilian who collects brass casings." "The captain asked me to help," Elizabeth said quietly, but there was something in her tone that hadn't been there before. A subtle edge that suggested Morrison's continued dismissiveness was wearing thin. "And I'm suggesting that maybe we should stick to qualified personnel," Morrison replied. "No offense, ma'am, but military marksmanship isn't exactly the same as plinking cans in someone's backyard." The comment drew a few chuckles from the assembled soldiers, but Master Sergeant Wilson frowned. He'd been thinking about their conversation from the previous week, and his instincts were telling him that there was more to Elizabeth Raines than met the eye. "Why don't we let her try?" Wilson suggested. "If she can't handle it, no harm done. If she can help us identify the scope issue, we save time and ammunition." Reynolds nodded. "My thinking exactly. Ms. Raines, are you willing to give it a try?" Elizabeth stood silent for a long moment, and those watching closely might have noticed that her hesitation wasn't about capability. It was about something else entirely. Finally, she nodded. All right, I'll do what I can to help. The rifle in question was a precision instrument, a military-grade sniper system with a high-powered scope designed for long-range accuracy. Reynolds led her to the 700-meter firing line where targets had been set up with small red dots at the center. The scope has been zeroed for this distance, Reynolds explained, but our best marksmen have been consistently shooting low and left. We think there's a mechanical issue with the scope mount, but we can't identify the problem. Elizabeth accepted the rifle with the same careful attention she gave to everything else. But as her hands closed around the stock, something changed. Her movements became more fluid, more purposeful. She examined the weapon with the kind of systematic thoroughness that suggested deep familiarity with similar systems. The scope mount looks solid, she said, checking the rings and bases. The problem might be with the internal tracking mechanisms. She adjusted the scope, making small modifications to the windage and elevation settings. Then, in a movement that surprised everyone watching, she tapped the rifle stock 3 times in a very specific rhythm, 2 quick taps followed by a longer one. Wilson felt a chill run down his spine. He'd seen that ritual before years ago, but couldn't quite place where. Elizabeth settled into firing position with the kind of smooth precision that comes from thousands of hours of practice. Her breathing settled into a controlled rhythm, and she acquired the target through the scope. The range fell silent as everyone waited to see what the quiet civilian volunteer could do with a precision rifle. She squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck the smallest red dot at 700 meters, dead center. Perfect bullseye. But it wasn't just the accuracy that stunned everyone into silence. It was the way she'd fired, without any of the usual shooter's movements or sounds. No adjustment of position, no visible recoil compensation, no vocal reaction to the shot. She'd simply acquired the target, controlled her breathing, and delivered the round with the kind of mechanical precision that suggested this wasn't her first time behind a precision rifle. Jesus, someone whispered. Elizabeth worked the bolt smoothly, chambering another round. She fired again. Another perfect center hit. Then a third shot, this one placed so precisely that it actually enlarged the same hole made by the first 2 rounds. The silence that followed was deafening. Every person on the range, from the newest recruit to the most experienced instructor, was staring at the quiet woman who just demonstrated marksmanship skills that most of them would never achieve. Elizabeth rose from the firing position. With the same fluid motion she'd used to assume it, she engaged the safety, cleared the chamber, and handed the rifle back to Captain Reynolds. The scope alignment is fine, she said in that same quiet voice. The issue is with the ammunition. The batch you've been using has a slightly different powder charge than what the scope was zeroed for. The compensation I made should work for this particular lot of rounds. Reynolds took the rifle with hands that were slightly unsteady. Where did you learn to shoot like that? For the first time since anyone had known her, Elizabeth hesitated in a way that suggested she was carefully considering her answer. I learned from my brother, she said finally. But there was something in her tone, something in the way she said, brother, that made it clear this wasn't just casual family teaching. This was something else entirely. Lieutenant Morrison was staring at her with an expression that mixed suspicion with something that might have been fear. That's professional-level marksmanship, he said slowly. Competition level. Maybe even military level. Elizabeth met his gaze steadily. My brother was a good teacher. What branch did he serve in? Morrison pressed. He didn't serve in any branch, Elizabeth replied. He served his country in other ways. The evasiveness of her answer only deepened the mystery. Wilson found himself studying her more carefully, looking for clues about who she really was. And that's when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. When she'd been firing, Elizabeth had moved with the kind of tactical precision that wasn't taught in regular military training. The way she'd positioned herself, the way she'd controlled her breathing, the way she'd withdrawn from the firing position, it was all textbook, but not from any textbook he'd ever seen. It was too precise, too controlled, too professional. This wasn't marksmanship training from a family member or even from standard military instruction. This was something else entirely. As Elizabeth packed up her cleaning supplies and prepared to leave, Wilson caught Reynolds' attention. "Captain," he said quietly, "I think we need to have a conversation about our volunteer." "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that woman just demonstrated skills that are way beyond anything she should have as a civilian. The way she handled that rifle, the technical knowledge she showed, the precision of those shots, that's not recreational shooting. That's professional training." Reynolds watched Elizabeth walking toward her car, her movements once again careful and measured. "You think she's former military?" "I think she might be current military," Wilson replied. "Or something else entirely. But either way, I think it's time we found out exactly who Elizabeth Raines really is." As Elizabeth's sedan disappeared down the access road, neither man could shake the feeling that they'd just witnessed something extraordinary. The quiet woman who collected brass casings had just demonstrated skills that would make most special forces operators jealous. But the real question wasn't about her marksmanship ability. The real question was why someone with those skills was spending her Saturdays cleaning up after junior soldiers and pretending to be nothing more than a helpful civilian volunteer. And Lieutenant Morrison, walking back to his office with a deep frown, found himself wondering if Elizabeth Raines' sudden appearance at the training facility was as coincidental as it seemed. For reasons he couldn't quite articulate, he was beginning to suspect that it wasn't coincidental at all. Monday morning brought an unusual level of activity to the Fort Jackson administrative offices. Captain Reynolds had arrived early, determined to get answers about the mysterious civilian volunteer who demonstrated impossible marksmanship skills. But what he found when he began digging only deepened the mystery. "There's a problem with the volunteer records," Specialist Thompson announced, looking up from her computer terminal with a confused expression. "I can't find any Elizabeth Raines in our civilian access system," Reynolds frowned. "That's impossible. She's been coming here for months. Someone had to process her volunteer application." "That's what I thought too, sir. But look at this." Thompson turned her monitor around. "The system shows volunteer applications processed in the past year, but there's no record of anyone named Elizabeth Raines. No background check, no access authorization, no emergency contact information, nothing." The implications were disturbing. How had Elizabeth been accessing the facility for months without proper clearance? Who had authorized her presence? And, more importantly, why was there no record of her existence in their system? "Run her face through the base facial recognition system," Reynolds ordered. "Maybe she's in the system under a different name." Thompson worked for several minutes, running Elizabeth's image through the security database. Finally, she turned back to Reynolds with an expression of genuine bewilderment. "Sir, the system is returning an error message. It says the image cannot be matched because the data has been deleted or encrypted at source." "I've never seen anything like this before." Reynolds felt a chill. Data encryption at that level wasn't something that happened by accident. It was the kind of security measure applied to people whose identities were classified for national security reasons. "Let me see that," he said, moving to look at the screen himself. The error message was cryptic but clear. Authentication failed. Source data encrypted. Access level insufficient. "Try running a deeper search," Reynolds suggested. "Maybe there's a system glitch." But when Thompson attempted to access higher level databases, the system responded with something that made both of them go silent. Access denied. Authentication code required. Dragon mark level 0. Reynolds stared at the screen, his mind racing. He'd been in the military for 15 years, and he'd never seen an authentication code like that. But something about the terminology made him deeply uncomfortable. "Sir," Thompson said quietly, "I think we need to contact the intelligence office. This isn't just a missing file. This is some kind of classified security protocol." Before Reynolds could respond, his phone rang. The caller ID showed an internal number he didn't recognize. "Captain Reynolds, this is Major Williams from Base Security. I need to see you in my office immediately. And bring whoever ran the facial recognition search." The tone was urgent, almost alarmed. Reynolds and Thompson exchanged glances, both recognizing that they'd apparently stumbled into something much bigger than a missing volunteer file. Major Williams' office was located in the secure section of the base administration building, behind multiple layers of security clearance. Williams himself was a tall, lean man in his mid-40s, with the kind of intense focus that suggested he'd seen classified material that most people couldn't imagine. "Captain, I need to ask you some questions about your civilian volunteer." Elizabeth Raines, Williams began without preamble. "Specifically, I need to know why you're running facial recognition searches on someone with Dragon Mark clearance." "Dragon Mark?" Reynolds repeated. "Major, I've never heard of that classification level." "That's because it's not supposed to exist," Williams replied grimly. Dragon Mark is a designation that was supposedly retired 20 years ago. It was used for a classified program that most people believed was completely shut down. He pulled out a thick folder marked with security classifications that Reynolds had never seen before. "Unit 0, Williams continued. "Have you ever heard of it?" Reynolds shook his head, but something in his expression suggested the name triggered a distant memory. Unit 0 was a special operations group that officially never existed. They were trained separately from all other military units, worked alone, and handled situations that were too sensitive for official records. Every member of the unit was given a code name, red followed by a number. They existed outside normal military structure, with clearance levels so high that even general officers couldn't access their files. Thompson shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Major, what does this have to do with Ms. Raines?" "Because Elizabeth Raines appears to be Red 0, Williams replied. "The coordinator of Unit 0, someone who never appeared in any official records, never received public recognition, and who was supposed to have disappeared completely when the program was terminated." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Reynolds found himself thinking about Elizabeth's marksmanship demonstration, her technical knowledge of weapon systems, the way she moved with tactical precision. "If she's really Red 0, he said slowly, "then why is she collecting brass casings in our training facility?" "That's exactly what I want to know," Williams replied. "And I think the answer might be connected to why Unit 0 was disbanded in the first place." He opened the folder and pulled out a series of documents with heavy black redactions. 20 years ago, Unit 0 was conducting classified operations in several countries that don't officially exist on our mission maps. Their last operation was called Nightfall, and it went wrong in a way that cost lives and compromised national security. "What kind of wrong?" Reynolds asked. "The kind that suggests someone leaked classified information to hostile forces. Someone with access to Unit 0 protocols and operational details. Someone who knew exactly how they operated and where they would be." The implications were staggering. If Elizabeth Raines was really Red 0, and if she was at Fort Jackson for a reason connected to a 20-year-old intelligence leak, then her presence wasn't coincidental at all. "Major," Thompson said quietly, "do you think she's here because she's identified the leak?" "I think she's here because she's been conducting her own investigation," Williams replied. and I think she's found her answer. Over the next hour, Williams shared what little information he could access about Unit Zero. The picture that emerged was of a group of soldiers who'd been trained to a level that exceeded most. Special operations units. They'd been given almost unlimited authority to complete objectives that couldn't be officially sanctioned, and they'd operated with a level of secrecy that made their very existence questionable. If Red Zero is really here, Williams concluded, then something significant is about to happen. People with that level of clearance don't surface unless they absolutely have to. Reynolds thought about Elizabeth's quiet demeanor, her careful movements, her reluctance to demonstrate her true capabilities. She's been watching us, he realized. For months, she's been observing our operations, our personnel, our procedures. She's been conducting surveillance. The question is, Williams said grimly, what was she looking for? And more importantly, did she find it? As if summoned by their conversation, Reynolds' phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The range will be closed for maintenance tomorrow. Personal matter to attend to. ER. Williams looked at the message with growing alarm. Captain, I think Red Zero is about to make her move. And I think we're about to discover why she's really been here. The investigation had revealed more questions than answers, but one thing was becoming clear. Elizabeth Raines wasn't just a civilian volunteer. She was a ghost from a classified program that wasn't supposed to exist, and she'd been conducting her own operation right under their noses. The only question now was whether they were about to witness justice or revenge. Elizabeth arrived at the range early Tuesday morning, 2 hours before her usual time. She carried a rifle case that the soldiers had never seen before, an older model that looked unremarkable but had been modified with precision components that spoke of professional-level customization. Word had spread about Monday's investigation, and an unusual number of personnel had found reasons to be at the range that morning. Captain Reynolds, Major Williams, Master Sergeant Wilson, and several others watched from various positions as Elizabeth methodically set up her equipment. Lieutenant Morrison was among them, but his presence seemed different from the others. While the rest appeared curious or cautious, Morrison looked distinctly uncomfortable. His eyes kept darting between Elizabeth and the various exit points, and he seemed to be calculating distances and angles in a way that suggested he was planning something. "Ma'am," Captain Reynolds called out as he approached, "I'm going to have to ask you to stop what you're doing. This area is restricted to authorized personnel only." Elizabeth continued setting up her scope, making precise adjustments with the kind of methodical calm that suggested she'd been expecting this confrontation. "I'm authorized," she said quietly. "According to our records, you're a civilian volunteer. You don't have authorization to bring personal weapons onto this facility." "According to your records, I don't exist at all," Elizabeth replied, her voice carrying a subtle edge that hadn't been there before. "Your system returned an error when you tried to identify me, didn't it?" The accuracy of her statement confirmed what Reynolds had suspected. Elizabeth knew about their investigation and had probably known about it from the beginning. "We know about Dragon Mark," Major Williams said, stepping forward. "We know about Unit Zero. The question is what you're doing here." Elizabeth paused in her scope adjustment and looked up at Williams with an expression that was impossible to read. "Unit Zero was disbanded 20 years ago, Major. Officially, it never existed. But you're Red Zero," Williams pressed. "The coordinator who never appeared in official records." "I'm someone who lost her brother to a traitor's greed," Elizabeth replied, her voice taking on a hardness that made several of the watching soldiers step back involuntarily. "I'm someone who spent 2 decades hunting the person who sold our operational intelligence to the highest bidder." She stood slowly, and for the first time since anyone had known her, Elizabeth Raines looked exactly like what she was. A highly trained operative who'd been concealing her true nature behind a mask of civilian harmlessness. "My brother was Red One," she continued. "David Rains. He died during Operation Nightfall when someone leaked our extraction coordinates to hostile forces. Someone who knew exactly how Unit Zero operated. Someone who had access to classified protocols. Someone who understood our communication systems well enough to predict our movements." Lieutenant Morrison had gone pale, and his hand was moving slowly toward his sidearm. But Elizabeth noticed the movement immediately. "I wouldn't recommend that, Lieutenant," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from years of command in life-or-death situations. "You've already made enough mistakes." Morrison froze, his hand halfway to his weapon. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You know exactly what I'm talking about," Elizabeth replied. "You've been selling Unit Zero tactical manuals to foreign contractors for 3 years. You killed my brother for money." The accusation hung in the air like a physical blow. Morrison's face went through several expressions: surprise, denial, fear, and finally a kind of desperate defiance. "That's impossible," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I don't know anything about Unit Zero or your brother, or whatever conspiracy theory you've constructed. 3 days ago, you dismissed my knowledge of the trigger mechanism malfunction," Elizabeth continued, her tone remaining calm but carrying an undercurrent of lethal certainty. "You said I couldn't possibly understand military weapon systems. But you also revealed that you knew I was right about the diagnosis." Morrison's breathing was becoming more rapid, and sweat was visible on his forehead, despite the cool morning air. "You see, Lieutenant, the specific malfunction I described isn't covered in standard military training manuals. The knowledge of sear engagement issues in that particular weapon system is only found in advanced armor training and in classified technical manuals that were developed for Unit Zero." She took a step closer to Morrison, her movement fluid and purposeful. "When you dismissed my expertise, you also demonstrated that you knew exactly what I was talking about. You knew I was right because you'd seen the technical specifications before, in classified documents that you weren't supposed to have access to." "That doesn't prove anything," Morrison said, but his voice was shaking now. "No," Elizabeth agreed, "but this does." She pulled out a cell phone and activated a recording application. Morrison's voice filled the air, clearly audible despite the background noise of the range. "The batch numbers for the Unit Zero technical manuals are in the usual location. The buyer wants the complete sniper training protocols and the communication encryption keys. Payment will be transferred to the Swiss account as soon as the documents are delivered." Morrison's face went completely white. "Where did you get that recording?" "From your phone," Elizabeth replied. "The same phone you used to coordinate the intelligence leak that got my brother killed. The same phone you've been using to sell classified information for 3 years." The recording had been made during a conversation Morrison thought was private, but Elizabeth had been monitoring his communications for weeks. Every transaction, every contact, every piece of evidence had been carefully documented. "You've been watching me," Morrison whispered. "I've been hunting you," Elizabeth corrected. "For 6 months, I've been conducting a private investigation into the intelligence leak that cost my brother's life. Intelligence suggested that classified Unit Zero training methods were being sold through military facilities. Methods that only we had developed. Techniques that got David killed when they were used against us." Major Williams stepped forward, his expression grim. "Lieutenant Morrison, you're under arrest for treason, espionage, and the sale of classified materials to foreign entities." But Morrison wasn't done fighting. In a move that surprised everyone except Elizabeth, he drew his sidearm and pointed it directly at her. "Nobody moves," he said, his voice cracking with desperation. "I don't know what kind of setup this is, but I'm not going down for something I didn't do." Elizabeth didn't even flinch. She stood perfectly still, her hands at her sides, watching Morrison with the kind of calm focus that suggested she'd been in similar situations before. "You made one critical mistake, Lieutenant," she said, her voice steady despite having a weapon pointed at her. "When you dismissed my knowledge of the trigger mechanism, you proved that you had access to classified technical information. But there was something else." She took a small step to her left, a movement so subtle that most of the watching soldiers didn't even notice it. But the step positioned her behind a concrete barrier that would provide cover if shooting started. "You knew exactly which manual contained that technical information. You knew because you'd sold it. Specifically, you sold it to a contractor who was working in the same region where my brother died. The same contractor who provided intelligence to the forces that ambushed Red One's extraction." Morrison's hand was shaking now, and the weapon was wavering between Elizabeth and the other soldiers. "You can't prove any of this." "Actually, I can," Elizabeth replied, "because you've been using the same communication protocols for 3 years. The same encryption, the same contact methods, the same financial accounts. You got comfortable, Lieutenant. You got sloppy." She pulled out a tablet and activated a display that showed Morrison's financial records, communication logs, and transaction histories. The evidence was overwhelming. Years of classified information sales, payments from foreign sources, and communication with known intelligence brokers. "The night David died," Elizabeth continued, her voice taking on a harder edge, "someone leaked our extraction coordinates to enemy forces. Someone who knew exactly how Unit Zero operated. Someone who understood our tactical procedures well enough to predict our movements." Morrison was backing toward one of the range exits, his weapon still trained on Elizabeth. "Even if that's true, you can't prove I was involved." "I can prove it because you made the same mistake twice," Elizabeth said. 20 years ago, you sold our extraction protocols. Last month, you sold our communication procedures to the same buyer. The transaction records show identical account numbers, identical contact methods, identical operational security failures. She gestured to the tablet, where financial records clearly show payments from foreign sources to accounts controlled by Morrison. "You killed my brother for $50,000, Lieutenant. You betrayed your country, your oath, and everything Unit Zero stood for because you wanted money." The accusation seemed to break something in Morrison. His desperate bravado crumbled, replaced by a combination of fear and rage that made him even more dangerous. "Your brother was a liability anyway," he snarled. "Unit Zero was out of control, operating without oversight, taking actions that put American interests at risk. Someone had to stop you." The admission was exactly what Elizabeth had been waiting for. Morrison had just confessed to treason in front of multiple witnesses, including a major and several senior non-commissioned officers. "So you decided to play judge and executioner," Elizabeth said. "You decided that you had the right to determine which military operations were acceptable and which weren't. And you decided that selling classified information to hostile forces was an appropriate way to express your disapproval." Morrison's response was to swing the weapon toward Major Williams, apparently deciding that eliminating witnesses was his best option, but he never got the chance to fire. Elizabeth moved with a speed and precision that stunned everyone watching. In one fluid motion, she closed the distance between herself and Morrison, disarmed him, and had him on the ground in a restraint hold that rendered him completely helpless. The entire sequence took less than 3 seconds. "The thing about Unit Zero training, Lieutenant," Elizabeth said as Morrison struggled uselessly against her hold, "is that it never really goes away. Muscle memory, tactical awareness, combat reflexes, they're all still there, even after 20 years. Military police arrived within minutes, having been summoned by Major Williams as soon as the confrontation began. Morrison was taken into custody, still protesting his innocence, but no longer able to deny the overwhelming evidence against him. As the MPs led him away, Morrison looked back at Elizabeth with a mixture of hatred and grudging respect. "You could have killed me," he said. "Why didn't you?" Elizabeth's response was quiet but carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Because my brother taught me that justice is more important than revenge. Because death would have been too easy for someone who betrayed everything we fought for." She paused, watching as Morrison was loaded into the police vehicle. "And because David always said that the best way to honor the fallen is to make sure their killers face the consequences of their actions." As the vehicle disappeared down the base access road, Elizabeth found herself surrounded by soldiers who were seeing her for the first time as she really was, not a quiet civilian volunteer, but a highly trained operative who'd spent months conducting a complex investigation while maintaining perfect operational security. "What happens now?" Captain Reynolds asked. Elizabeth looked around at the faces surrounding her, some shocked, some respectful, some still processing what they'd witnessed. Now Morrison faces trial for treason. The intelligence he sold will be assessed for damage, and hopefully some of the harm he caused can be mitigated. "And what about you?" Major Williams asked. "What does Red Zero do now?" Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. She'd spent 20 years hunting her brother's killer, and now that hunt was over. For the first time in 2 decades, she didn't have a mission driving her forward. "I think," she said finally, "that Red Zero has been officially retired for long. Enough. It's time for Elizabeth Raines to figure out what comes next." The interrogation room at Fort Jackson's military police station had seen its share of serious cases, but nothing quite like this. Lieutenant Morrison sat across from a team of military investigators, federal agents, and intelligence officers who'd arrived within hours of his arrest. The evidence against him was overwhelming, but the full scope of his betrayal was only beginning to emerge. Elizabeth sat in an adjacent observation room, watching the proceedings through one-way glass. She'd shed the persona of the quiet civilian volunteer completely now, and her bearing made it clear to everyone present that they were in the presence of someone with extensive operational experience. "For the record," the lead investigator sighed, "state your name and rank." "Lieutenant James Morrison, United States Army," Morrison replied, his voice hollow with defeat. "Lieutenant Morrison, you're charged with treason, espionage, and the sale of classified materials to foreign entities. How do you plead?" Morrison was silent for a long moment. The evidence was undeniable. Financial records, communication, logs, recorded conversations. His lawyer, a military defense attorney who'd arrived that morning, had already advised him that fighting the charges would be futile. "Before I answer that," Morrison said, "I want to know something. How long has she been watching me?" The investigator followed Morrison's gaze toward the observation window. "You're referring to the individual known as Red Zero?" "I'm referring to Elizabeth Raines," Morrison said. "Or whoever she really is. How long has she been conducting surveillance on me?" In the observation room, Elizabeth spoke into the intercom system. 6 months, Lieutenant. Ever since intelligence analysis identified Fort Jackson as a potential source of the leaked Unit Zero materials." Her voice carried through speakers in the interrogation room, and Morrison flinched as if struck. 6 months of watching, evaluating, gathering evidence. 6 months of you treating me like some harmless cleaning lady while I documented every aspect of your operation. "The shell casings," Morrison whispered, understanding flooding his features. "You weren't just cleaning up. You were." "I was conducting detailed surveillance of training procedures, personnel interactions, and operational security protocols," Elizabeth confirmed. "Every Saturday for 6 months, I observed how information flowed through this facility, who had access to what materials, and how classified procedures were being handled. The lead investigator leaned forward. "Lieutenant Morrison, our records show that you've been selling classified materials for approximately 3 years. Can you confirm this timeline?" Morrison's shoulders sagged in defeat. "Yes, and these materials included Unit 0 tactical manuals, training protocols, and operational procedures?" "Yes, materials that were used by hostile forces to plan and execute attacks against American military personnel." Morrison was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I never intended for anyone to get killed." In the observation room, Elizabeth's hands clenched into fists. Through the intercom, her voice was ice cold. "My brother David died because you sold our extraction coordinates to a contractor who was working with hostile forces. Red One died because you wanted money." "I thought the information was being used for defensive purposes," Morrison said desperately. "I was told it was for training Allied forces, for improving their capabilities against terrorist threats." "You were told what you wanted to hear," Elizabeth replied. "You knew exactly what you were doing, Lieutenant. You knew that classified American military techniques were being sold to the highest bidder, and you didn't care as long as you got paid." The investigator pulled out a thick folder containing Morrison's financial records. "These bank transfers show payments totaling over $200,000 over 3 years. That's significantly more than a lieutenant's salary, wouldn't you agree?" Morrison nodded miserably. "And these payments came from accounts controlled by foreign intelligence services and private military contractors known to work with hostile governments?" "I didn't know that at the time," Morrison protested. "But you knew it was wrong," the investigator pressed. "You knew you were violating your oath, betraying your country, and putting American lives at risk." Morrison's defense attorney whispered something in his ear, but Morrison shook his head. "I want to make a statement." The room fell silent, everyone waiting for what Morrison would say next. "I started selling information because I was in debt," Morrison began, his voice shaking. "Gambling debts, credit card bills, a divorce that wiped out my savings. When someone approached me about providing training materials for Allied forces, it seemed like a solution to my problems." "Who approached you?" the investigator asked. "A contractor named Richards. He said he worked for a company that provided training support to friendly governments. He made it sound patriotic, like I was helping to improve the capabilities of our allies." Elizabeth's voice came through the intercom again. "Martin Richards was a known intelligence broker who sold American military secrets to anyone willing to pay. He was killed in Syria 2 years ago, probably by one of his own clients who decided he knew too much." Morrison's face went white. "He's dead." "Most of the people in your network are dead, Lieutenant. That's what happens to traitors. Eventually, they become liabilities to their handlers." The investigator continued his questioning, and over the next hour, a picture emerged of a complex intelligence operation that had been running for years. Morrison had been providing classified materials to a network of brokers and contractors who sold them to hostile governments and terrorist organizations. The Unit 0 materials were particularly valuable, Morrison admitted. They contained training techniques and tactical procedures that weren't available anywhere else. The buyers were willing to pay premium prices for that information. And you knew that these techniques could be used against American forces? Morrison was quiet for a long moment. "I knew it was possible," he said finally. "But I told myself that the information was too old to be useful, that Unit 0 had been disbanded and the techniques weren't being used anymore." "Except that members of Unit 0 were still alive," Elizabeth said through the intercom. "People like my brother who continued to use those techniques in classified operations. People who died because you sold their tactical procedures to their enemies. The interrogation continued for several more hours, with Morrison providing details about his network of contacts, his methods of communication, and the specific materials he'd sold. The damage assessment would take months to complete, but it was already clear that Morrison's betrayal had compromised multiple operations and cost American lives. Finally, the lead investigator asked the question that everyone had been waiting for. "Lieutenant Morrison, how do you plead to the charges of treason, espionage, and the sale of classified materials to foreign entities?" Morrison looked toward the observation window, knowing that Elizabeth was watching. When he spoke, his voice was filled with exhaustion and regret. "Guilty," he said. "Guilty to all charges." In the observation room, Elizabeth felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been served, but it couldn't bring David back. It couldn't undo 20 years of wondering who had betrayed Unit Zero or erase the pain of losing her brother to a traitor's greed. But it was something. It was accountability. It was proof that even the most carefully hidden betrayals would eventually come to light. As the formal proceedings concluded and Morrison was led away to await sentencing, Elizabeth found herself thinking about David and what he would have said about this moment. He'd always believed that justice was more important than revenge, that the system was worth preserving even when it failed individual people. She hoped he would have been proud of how she'd handled the investigation. She'd gathered evidence methodically, built an airtight case, and ensured that Morrison would face the full consequences of his actions. She'd done it without compromising her principles or resorting to the kind of violence that had claimed so many of her Unit Zero colleagues. Most importantly, she'd done it in a way that honored David's memory and upheld the values they both sworn to defend. The hunt was over. After 20 years, her brother's killer had been brought to justice. Now Elizabeth had to figure out what came next. The military courtroom at Fort Leavenworth was filled with an unusual mix of personnel: active duty officers, federal investigators, intelligence officials, and a handful of people whose presence suggested that this case had implications far beyond a simple betrayal. Lieutenant Morrison sat at the defendant's table, flanked by his military defense attorneys, facing charges that could result in life imprisonment or even the death penalty. Elizabeth sat in the witness section, wearing civilian clothes but carrying herself with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to command. Over the past month, as the case had been prepared for trial, more details about Unit Zero had emerged, painting a picture of an operation that had been far more extensive and significant than most people had realized. "The court calls Elizabeth Raines to testify," the military judge announced. Elizabeth rose and walked to the witness stand with the same measured pace she'd used during her months of surveillance at Fort Jackson. As she was sworn in, every person in the courtroom focused their complete attention on the woman who'd brought down a spy ring that had been operating for years. "Please state your name and occupation for the record," the prosecutor requested. "Elizabeth Raines, formerly Red Zero, Unit Zero, United States Special Operations Command." The formal acknowledgement of her identity sent a ripple through the courtroom. For most of the people present, this was their first confirmation that Unit Zero had actually existed. "Ms. Raines, can you describe your relationship to the defendant?" "Lieutenant Morrison killed my brother," Elizabeth said simply. "He sold classified information that directly resulted in the death of Red One during Operation Nightfall 20 years ago." Morrison's defense attorney objected, arguing that Elizabeth's statement was prejudicial, but the judge overruled the objection. The evidence connecting Morrison's intelligence sales to the Unit Zero casualties was well documented. "Can you explain to the court how you came to suspect Lieutenant Morrison's involvement in the intelligence leak?" Elizabeth's testimony was methodical and devastating. She described how intelligence analysis had identified Fort Jackson as a potential source of leaked Unit Zero materials, how she'd established her cover identity as a civilian volunteer, and how she'd conducted 6 months of surveillance to identify the traitor. The defendant's knowledge of classified technical information was the first indication that he had access to materials he shouldn't have possessed, Elizabeth explained. His reaction to my demonstration of weapons expertise confirmed that he recognized Unit Zero techniques. And how did you gather evidence of his espionage activities? Through electronic surveillance authorized under national security protocols, Elizabeth replied. Lieutenant Morrison was using unsecured communication methods to coordinate intelligence sales. His operational security was poor, which made documentation of his activities relatively straightforward. The prosecutor presented evidence that Elizabeth had gathered recorded phone conversations, financial records, communication logs, and transaction histories that painted a clear picture of Morrison's betrayal. The sheer volume of classified information he'd sold was staggering. Ms. Raines, in your professional opinion, what was the impact of Lieutenant Morrison's actions on American national security? Elizabeth was quiet for a moment, considering her answer carefully. Unit Zero techniques were developed specifically for high-risk operations in hostile environments. Those techniques kept my colleagues alive in situations where conventional military training would have failed. When Lieutenant Morrison sold that information to foreign contractors, he gave our enemies the tools they needed to kill American soldiers. She looked directly at Morrison as she continued. My brother David died because the people who ambushed his extraction team knew exactly how Unit Zero operated. They knew our communication protocols, our tactical procedures, our extraction methods. They knew because Lieutenant Morrison sold them that information. Morrison's face was pale, but he met Elizabeth's gaze without flinching. For the first time since his arrest, he seemed to understand the full magnitude of what he'd done. The defense attorney's cross-examination focused on Elizabeth's methods and her authority to conduct surveillance operations. But her answers were precise and unassailable. Everything she'd done had been authorized through proper channels, and her evidence had been gathered legally. Ms. Raines, the defense attorney said, isn't it true that you came to Fort Jackson with the preconceived notion that someone there was guilty of espionage? I came to Fort Jackson because intelligence analysis indicated that classified Unit Zero materials were being leaked from that facility, Elizabeth replied. I didn't know who was responsible until I gathered sufficient evidence to identify Lieutenant Morrison as the source. But you were determined to find someone to blame for your brother's death, weren't you? Elizabeth's response was calm but carried an edge of steel. I was determined to find the person who actually was responsible for my brother's death. The evidence shows that person was Lieutenant Morrison. When the defense finished their cross-examination, the prosecutor called several additional witnesses, intelligence officials who could speak to the damage caused by Morrison's betrayal, financial experts who could explain the money trail, and military officers who could testify to the classified nature of the materials he'd sold. But the most powerful testimony came from Colonel James Harrison, who'd served as David Raines' commanding officer during Operation Nightfall. Red One was one of the finest soldiers I ever had the privilege to command, Harrison said, his voice thick with emotion. He died because someone betrayed the location of his extraction point to hostile forces. We always suspected there was a leak, but we could never identify the source. Harrison looked directly at Morrison. To know that an American officer sold information that led to Red One's death. It's a betrayal that goes beyond comprehension. The trial lasted 3 days, but the outcome was never really in doubt. The evidence against Morrison was overwhelming, and his own confession had eliminated any possibility of acquittal. The only question was the severity of his sentence. During the sentencing phase, Morrison was given the opportunity to make a statement to the court. He stood slowly, his shoulders bent with the weight of his crimes. "I want to say something to Ms. Raines," he said, his voice barely audible. "I never intended for your brother to die. I know that doesn't matter now, and I know it doesn't change anything. But I want you to know that I've thought about what I did every day for 20 years. Elizabeth watched him without expression, waiting for him to continue. "I was weak," Morrison said. "I was selfish and greedy and weak. I told myself that I was just selling information, that I wasn't really hurting anyone. But I knew better. I knew that every piece of classified material I sold could be used against American forces." He paused, struggling to find words for what. He wanted to say, "I can't bring your brother back. I can't undo the damage I caused. But I want you to know that I'm sorry. I'm truly, deeply sorry for what I did." Elizabeth stood to respond, and the courtroom fell completely silent. "Lieutenant Morrison," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room, "my brother used to say that apologies without accountability are just words. You're sorry because you got caught, not because you recognized the wrongness of your actions." She paused, letting her words sink in. "But David also taught me that forgiveness isn't about excusing someone's actions. It's about refusing to let their betrayal poison your own soul. So I forgive you, Lieutenant Morrison. Not because you deserve it, but because carrying hatred for 20 years has cost me enough." The judge's sentence was severe, but not unexpected. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, to be served at the military disciplinary barracks at Fort Leavenworth. Morrison would spend the rest of his life paying for his betrayal. As the court was dismissed and Morrison was led away in shackles, Elizabeth felt a strange sense of completion. The hunt that had defined her life for 20 years was finally over. Her brother's killer had been brought to justice, and the intelligence network he'd been part of had been dismantled. But completion brought its own challenges. For the first time in decades, Elizabeth Raines had to figure out who she was when she wasn't hunting her brother's killer. The answer to that question would define the next chapter of her life. 3 months after Lieutenant Morrison's sentencing, Elizabeth found herself back at Fort Jackson for the first time since the trial. But this visit was different. She wasn't here as an undercover operative gathering evidence or as a witness, testifying against a traitor. She was here because she'd been invited. The invitation had come from Captain Reynolds, who'd written to ask if she would consider speaking to the advanced training classes about operational security and the real world. Consequences of intelligence failures. It was an unusual request, but Elizabeth had found herself accepting without really understanding why. The briefing room was packed with Special Forces candidates, training instructors, and senior officers who'd come to hear from the legendary Red Zero. Elizabeth stood at the front of the room, no longer hiding behind the persona of a quiet civilian volunteer. She wore simple civilian clothes, but her bearing made it clear to everyone present that they were in the presence of someone with extraordinary experience. 20 years ago, she began, my brother and I were part of a classified unit that officially never existed. We conducted operations in places that don't appear on official maps, against enemies who were never publicly acknowledged. We saved lives, prevented attacks, and protected American interests in ways that will never be recognized or celebrated. The room was absolutely silent, every person hanging on her words. We did this work because we believed it was necessary, because we understood that sometimes the most important battles are fought by people whose names will never be known, whose sacrifices will never be acknowledged, whose families will never receive medals or recognition for their loss. She paused, looking around the room at the young faces staring back at her. My brother died because someone we trusted decided that money was more important than loyalty. Someone who took an oath to defend this country chose instead to sell its secrets to the highest bidder. Elizabeth's voice hardened slightly. The person who killed my brother wore the same uniform you wear. He took the same oath you've taken. He was supposed to be someone my brother could trust with his life. The implications of her words were clear to everyone in the room. The greatest threats to military operations didn't always come from foreign enemies. Sometimes they came from within. Lieutenant Morrison's betrayal wasn't just about selling classified information, Elizabeth continued. It was about breaking the fundamental trust that makes military operations possible. When soldiers can't trust their own colleagues, when they have to worry that their tactical procedures might be known to their enemies, when they suspect that their communications might be compromised, that's when the entire system starts to break down. She gestured toward the Special Forces candidates in the front row. Every one of you will eventually be responsible for the lives of other soldiers. You'll be trusted with classified information, sensitive operations, and strategic decisions that could affect national security. The question isn't whether you'll face temptation. The question is how you'll respond when that temptation comes. Elizabeth spent the next hour discussing operational security, intelligence protection, and the importance of maintaining professional standards even when facing personal challenges. But the real message was simpler than any specific procedure or protocol. Honor isn't just about following orders or completing missions, she said as she concluded her presentation. Honor is about being worthy of the trust that others place in you. It's about understanding that the uniform you wear represents something bigger than yourself. When the presentation ended, Elizabeth was approached by Master Sergeant Wilson, who'd been instrumental in beginning the investigation that led to Morrison's capture. "Ms. Rains," Wilson said, "I have to ask, what are you going to do now? The hunt is over. Morrison is in prison. Justice has been served. What comes next? For Red Zero?" Elizabeth was quiet for a moment, considering the question that had been haunting her for months. "I've been asking myself the same thing," she admitted. "For 20 years, my life has been defined by finding my brother's killer. Now that mission is complete, and I have to figure out who Elizabeth Rains is when she's not hunting someone. Have you come up with any answers?" "I think so," Elizabeth said slowly. "I think David would want me to use what I learned from this experience to help prevent other betrayals, other intelligence failures, other soldiers from dying because someone they trusted decided to sell them out." She gestured toward the training facility around them. "These young soldiers deserve better than what my brother got. They deserve to know that the people they serve with are worthy of their trust. Maybe I can help ensure that." Over the following weeks, Elizabeth began working with military intelligence and training commands to develop new protocols for identifying potential security risks and protecting classified information. Her experience hunting Morrison had given her unique insights into how intelligence networks operated and how betrayals could be detected before they caused catastrophic damage. She also began speaking at military installations around the country, sharing the story of Unit Zero and the importance of maintaining honor even in the face of personal challenges. Her presentations were always well received, but more importantly, they seemed to have a real impact on the soldiers who heard them. 6 months after Morrison's trial, Elizabeth received a letter that would change her life once again. It was from the Department of Defense, offering her a position as a senior advisor on counterintelligence and operational security. The job would involve developing new training programs, investigating security breaches, and working to prevent the kind of betrayal that had cost her brother's life. It was, she realized, exactly what David would have wanted her to do. Elizabeth accepted the position, but with one condition. She wanted to maintain her connection to Fort Jackson, continuing to work with the training facility where she'd finally found her brother's killer. The base had become a symbol of both betrayal and justice, and she felt that her story needed to end where it had begun. 1 year after Morrison's sentencing, Elizabeth stood once again at the Fort Jackson firing range. But this time, she wasn't alone. A group of advanced training instructors stood with her, learning the tactical procedures that Unit Zero had developed and understanding how those procedures could be used to protect American soldiers in hostile environments. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same techniques that Morrison had sold to enemy forces were now being used to train the next generation of American Special Operations personnel. David's legacy was being preserved and protected, even as Morrison spent his days in a military prison cell. As the training session concluded, Elizabeth found herself thinking about the quiet woman who'd spent 6 months collecting brass casings and watching soldiers practice their marksmanship. That woman had been driven by grief, anger, and a burning need for justice. She'd been willing to sacrifice everything to find her brother's killer and bring him to account for his crimes. But Elizabeth Raines was no longer that woman. The hunt was over. Justice had been served, and she'd found a new purpose that honored David's memory while protecting other soldiers from similar betrayals. She'd learned that sometimes the most important victories aren't won on battlefields or in courtrooms. Sometimes they're won by people who choose to build something positive from their pain, who use their losses to protect others from similar tragedies. Elizabeth had spent 20 years learning to be a hunter. Now she was learning to be a guardian. As she walked away from the range, Elizabeth felt something she hadn't experienced in decades: peace. Not the peace that comes from ending a conflict, but the peace that comes from understanding your purpose and knowing that you're exactly where you're supposed to be. David would have been proud. In the end, that was all that mattered. There are people who don't need medals, don't need recognition, don't need their names in history books. Their silence itself is a lesson to the world. They represent all the quiet guardians who keep us safe, the people who work in shadows so that others can live in the light. Sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones whose names we'll never know, but whose actions change everything. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.